narrative review, the one that most of us are familiar with. We'll briefly touch on a scoping review, and then briefly discuss two aggregative reviews, systematic and meta-analyses. Thereafter, we'll identify some strategies to develop a literature review, as well as how to organize a literature review. We'll understand some common mistakes we make and what to avoid when you conduct a literature review. And then feeding from the strategies for developing and organizing a literature review, we'll briefly learn how to write a literature review, which is obviously the biggest skill that we need to learn as aspiring academics. So I would assume some, if not most of you, are attending today's webinar because as students, we've in the past have had to write literature reviews as part of assignments or graduate theses. And if you're doing something like a master's or PhD, this is usually quite a big part of the output that you're producing, right? And a full disclaimer: a literature review is, for me, often the most difficult part of an academic paper or of a graduate thesis, because it requires quite a lot of hard work and time invested. And also it requires some skill and creativity on your part to create and produce a really thorough literature review. And I think if we can reserve some of our apprehensions towards a literature review, we can do that through understanding what the purpose is. And we conduct literature reviews to provide an overview of current knowledge on a specific topic in order to identify evidence-based practice, theories, methods, and gaps in the existing research. And it is a crucial component to the research process for the following reasons. Firstly, it provides an account of what do we know on a specific topic or phenomenon. Secondly, it determines the gaps and or inconsistencies in a body of knowledge. What do we know? What do we not know about a specific topic? It determines the need for replicating research in different settings and samples. If you work in psychology in South Africa, most of our theories are informed from settings in the global north, and we need to make sure that their findings, their theories, their methods apply in our setting and on our population. And finally, it also provides a foundation for the development of hypotheses and methods in our own research. And that's something I'll speak to towards the end of today's webinar. We have to acknowledge that conducting a literature review can be laborious, and some may say tedious, but it is essential to have to conduct any successful and essential research. So in general, a literature review can take one of two overarching forms. The first form is what most of us are familiar with, and that's the background section to a research study. So if you write a journal article, there's usually an introduction/background where you review what is currently known in the field. And often if you do a master's, some of you for an honors project or a doctoral dissertation, it's a second or third chapter where you review all the literature pertinent to your research topic. The purpose of this type of review is to synthesize or summarize all the relevant literature to your topic of inquiry, to secondly provide a theoretical foundation to a research study, which is really important, and finally to validate methods used in a research study. And this form of literature review is what will be the focus of today's webinar and how to write one. The second and more common one that we find nowadays, or more prominent, if I can say that, is research AO ipso, right? Where a review is a research output in and of itself. If you think about systematic reviews, considering the wealth of information that is out there nowadays, systematic reviews have come to the forefront to create a solid point of departure for scholars interested in a certain topic. And these articles represent powerful resources for researchers, practitioners, policymakers to guide their decision-making in practice. It's often highly cited and impactful in nature. And I want to start off here by distinguishing between a literature review for a research study and this type of research output in and of itself. You usually write a literature review as the second chapter of your graduate thesis. The second form, this research AO ipso, is your research study. This is the outcome. So a systematic review would never be the second chapter will often not be the second chapter of a methods or a master's thesis. That would be your whole master's thesis because it's such a large undertaking. And I'll go into more detail in the next slides. So the first one, the narrative review, the first form that we spoke about now is often the traditional literature review, and it's associated with the first form discussed before. This type of review attempts to synthesize or summarize what has been written on a certain topic, and importantly, does not attempt to generate cumulative knowledge from what is being reviewed, where that is often the purpose of a systematic review. The purpose of a narrative review is to provide the reader with a comprehensive background for understanding current knowledge and highlighting the significance of new research, often your research and why you're undertaking this study. A narrative review can inspire research ideas through identifying gaps and/or inconsistencies in knowledge. And this in turn is used to generate research questions and hypotheses. And that's how my own PhD developed. I initially wanted to do a specific topic. Through reviewing the literature, found that there's this massive gap in psychometric testing in South Africa and reshaped my entire study. However, a narrative review is not, the gold standard because it's often critiqued for being unstructured and unsystematic. But there are certain strategies that you can employ to make it more structured and more systematic to get the most comprehensive review of what is currently known about a specific topic. Second type of review that we'll briefly discuss is a scoping review, and this provides an initial indication of the scope, specifically the size and nature of extant knowledge on an emergent topic. And it's often used to determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review. So basically, you do a scoping review when there's not enough known about a specific topic, and rather than doing a full systematic review, you first determine the scope of extant literature to determine whether yes or no I should do a literature review. The goal or purpose, the main objective is to be as comprehensive as possible, including grey literature, which we'll speak about later. And the inclusion and exclusion criteria used to scope literature is pertinent to a specific research question. And ultimately, you decide whether you should do a systematic review or not do a systematic review once you conclude your scoping review. So a systematic review in, I would say, the past 15 years has developed and become quite prominent considering the wealth of information that is available out there. If you think about 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you had to conduct a literature review, you only had access to hard copy books in your local library. Now, if you do a basic Google Scholar search, within microseconds, you have over 200,000 hits of potential studies that you could review. So this was a systematic review was developed in response to this overwhelming body of literature that is available to us as researchers and students. And this type of review attempts to aggregate, appraise, and synthesize all empirical evidence. And the emphasis there is on every single study that relates to your topic, that meet a set of previously specified eligibility criteria. These systematic reviews are conducted in order to answer a clearly formulated and often narrow research question, considering that you're synthesizing all empirical evidence on a specific topic of interest to support evidence-based practice. And the purpose is often to identify causation, because remember, in narrative review, you're trying to provide a comprehensive overview of what is known on a certain topic, where with a systematic review, you're trying to identify what works for what outcome. Systematic reviews adhere to very rigorous methodological guidelines aimed at reducing random and systematic errors. And the main procedures involved in a systematic review, and again, because we've got limited scope, there's much more to say about these 6 points. But in general, firstly, you formulate a review question and you develop a search strategy based on explicit inclusion criteria for the identification of eligible studies. Thereafter, you start searching for these studies through multiple databases and information sources, including grey literature. So grey literature is policy briefs, stuff that's not necessarily in a journal article, but could still speak to your specific topic. Thereafter, you select the studies, you extract their data, and you assess risk of bias. You start analyzing data using specific methods, whether it's a qualitative or quantitative synthesis. You present the result in a summary of finding tables, and you interpret the results and drawing conclusions. Because often your question would be, what is the most effective treatment for depression? You interpret the results of all the studies you review. You find that X amount of sessions or X amount of medication in this context is found to be the most effective. The next that we often use is a meta-analysis, and you follow similar procedures as in a systematic review, but they use meta-analyses use statistical methods to combine the results of independent studies into a single quantitative estimate or summary effect size. Meta-analyses use specific analytical models, often fixed or random effects models, to combine the results of studies. So you use mean odds ratios and mean scores from multiple studies to review and to assess the statistical heterogeneity and calculate weighted average of the effect estimates from different studies considering their sample sizes. And this summary effect size is a value that reflects the average magnitude of the treatment intervention effect, or more generally, you just want to find out the strength of a relationship between two variables across all the studies included in the systematic review. By combining these data statistically from multiple studies, meta-analyses create more accurate and reliable estimates of treatment/intervention effects than those derived from individual studies, because you're combining multiple sources of data. And for this reason, they're regarded as powerful tools for deriving meaningful conclusions about what treatment works best, what type of therapy is most effective. However, it's not always appropriate to aggregate the combined data sources due to varying measurement tools, outcome of interest, or clinical heterogeneity, and in these circumstances, qualitative systematic reviews are more appropriate. And considering the amount of systematic reviews that have boomed in social sciences in the past couple of years, scholars and researchers have now started to conduct umbrella reviews, so reviews or of systematic reviews, and they follow the same procedures as conventional systematic reviews, but only include other systematic reviews as a resource to get a really powerful idea of the available evidence. So that's the overview of the different types of common reviews that we find in social sciences. But now I want to turn our attention to developing a structured narrative review and the steps that you can follow to provide some structure to the traditional narrative literature review. So the first step, which seems pretty apparent, is you search for the relevant literature, right? But it's really difficult to search for something if you don't know what you're searching for. So for that reason, you need a clearly defined topic. So the aim of any narrative review, and any research study for that matter, is to address a specific research question. Your research question should be specific and measurable. And if your topic is too broad or not defined clearly enough, you will struggle to find relevant resources. If your topic is too narrow, you'll struggle to find literature to include in your review. So an example of a well-developed research question is, what are the determinants of condom use among adolescent men and women in low and middle income countries? If it was too narrow or too broad, you would ask, what are the determinants of condom use? If it was too narrow, you would add a lot of other parameters that would make it really difficult to find something pertinent to your topic. Once you've identified and defined your topic and formulated your research question, the next step to structure your narrative review is to find or identify the search terms or keywords. You usually, if you read a paper, after the abstract, there's a section called keywords, and those are the keywords that if you search for it through a database or Google Scholar, it would pick that up as a hit towards your research topic. So if we think about our research question about condom use, keywords for that would be condoms, contraception, protected sex or safe sex. It would be adolescents, teenagers, youth, etc. Once you have your keywords, you can now go to pre-identified databases and search for those keywords to find relevant articles. In psychology, popular databases that we often use is EBSCO, Scopus, Psych Articles, PubMed, Web of Science, and there's many more. If it's quite a broad topic, I like to start off with Google Scholar as a useful resource and then filter through the citation function. I see which papers are cited the most and then start from there to see which other papers have cited those papers and so on. To narrow your search, you can use what we call Boolean terms, and often the most common ones are and, or not. And each of those Boolean terms has a specific function to make your search more narrow and specific to your specific research question. So Boolean term of and is when you find sources that contain more than one keyword, right? So it could be condoms and adolescents and LMIC. So you want those three keywords together to produce a result for studies that have conducted in those settings with these topics with that participant population. Boolean term of or is used to find sources that contain one or a range of synonyms, so condoms or contraception or protected sex. And then you use Boolean term not to exclude results. If you're only looking for results to do with adolescents, you would say adolescents and not adults. So you exclude results from adults. Beware of the title of papers you include in a traditional review because often they are misleading. Remember, as psychologists, we try to look fancy and be creative, so we always use fancy headings and titles for our papers. To find the most appropriate papers for a review, read the abstract first before you download the PDF to find out whether the article is relevant to your research question. And as I've mentioned before, to identify the most important publications on your topic, take note of recurring citations. If the same author's books or articles keep appearing in your reading list, you need to seek them out if it didn't come up in your initial search. So if everyone is citing Rabi 2023, you need to go find out what Rabi 2023 is saying, and then potentially include that manuscript in your review. So now that you've searched for the literature, you can now evaluate and identify the sources, right? If you search for a few keywords now on Google, you'll have more than 200,000 responses and potential papers, and it's impossible to read everything. And that's often why we're apprehensive about a literature review, because the undertaking seems so big, right? You have all these potential papers, you lose the plot and you think, I'm never going to be able to get through this. And it's impossible to read everything. So that should calm your nerves, that it's not expected that you should read every single paper on your topic. This is not a systematic review where you have defined criteria and you have to include all empiric evidence. So instead of reading everything, you need to critically determine which sources are relevant to your review. And you do this by asking yourself these questions, but even more questions that you can develop with your peers and with your supervisors. So firstly, what question is the author addressing? And is this question relevant to my research question? To determine whether you can identify a source, you can ask yourself, what are the key concepts and how they are defined? Or what are the key insights and arguments? What are the results and the conclusions of the study? Or does the publication confirm, add to, or challenge established knowledge? Usually with a narrative review, you want to give a rounded perspective of what is known of a topic. You don't only want to report on the positive evidence for something, because obviously there's always some contrary finding in some setting. You also want to add what are the strengths and weaknesses to research. And that's where your own voice comes in as the author of this narrative review. So it's your responsibility to include credible peer-reviewed resources. And remember, evidence constantly changes. What was evident 10 years ago may have changed right now by the way that things are evolving in the fourth industrial revolution. There's no set rule to this, but a good rule of thumb is to include publications not older than 10 years. But you also need to make sure that you include seminal or landmark publications that change the field or the way that, a theory or the way that something was approached from a methodological approach. If you're busy with a PhD minimum takes about 3 years, but most people 4 to 5 years. So the literature you reviewed for your second chapter when you were in your first or second year of your PhD may have changed by now that you're writing your discussion. So that also needs to be updated and reviewed as you work through your PhD. Because remember, again, the purpose of this type of review is to synthesize what has been written on a specific topic, but not all research as in with a systematic review. So you start by reading articles, chapters, and books that are pertinent to your topic, that have many citations, and you look at the papers that have cited this specific article. And you read those and you follow this trend. This will help you identify sources that may not be captured by your initial search. And you can also consult the references and or bibliography of these sources to identify additional literature. So now that you've done an evaluation, you identify themes, gaps, and disputes. So often you start to identify certain themes, debates, and hopefully gaps in the knowledge as you review more and more papers. And your review should reflect this. In other words, you should include positive results, null results, results that still need to be explored, etc. There's often also pivotal publications that change our approach to specific problems. So these types of publications and its effect on excellent knowledge should be included. That's what I refer to when I say seminal or pivotal publications. So consider the following when you review the resources. What are the trends and patterns? So do certain approaches become more or less popular over time? So early theoretical approaches may have been dominated by or informed by psychotherapy, but in the past 20 years, CBT is the dominant evidence-based approach. Themes, what questions or concepts recur across literature? If you work in psychometric assessment, for example, cross-cultural applicability of a test is always a recurring theme. Debates, conflicts, and contradictions. Where do sources disagree? Is this different across groups? That's really important to include, and that's an easy way to structure when you write it up. And most importantly, hopefully there's a gap, and your study, you're reviewing literature to address this gap. So what do we know? For example, we know that there's many barriers to medication adherence. People drop out, there's transport, social responsibilities, etc. But we really do not know if someone's dropped out of HIV care, why do they return? So that's research, a research gap that you can address with your own research. So by identifying these themes and gaps as you read, it's a useful step to start structuring the write-up of your literature review. So as you read, you should have a piece of paper next to you that you can scribble and you can see these are the themes, and this is how I think that I should organize this. And here's a way that you can not only organize the review itself, but also think about how you can write it up. So there are many, many ways to organize a literature review, and these are just 4 basic ways that you can do it as a starting point. You should have a rough idea of your strategy before you start writing. So if you have a whiteboard in the office that you work or at home, or you have a blank piece of paper, it's really good practice to outline what you're going to write in which section, so that you don't sit with writer's block or that blank page and the cursor blinking at you the whole time. That's what also makes us feel frustrated. So there are 4 ways that I'm going to discuss that you can organize your review and then organize the write-up that we'll focus on after this. So the first and most simplest approach is by organizing your review in a chronological way, or the development of a topic over time. Right, so my PhD had a literature review chapter and then a theoretical chapter, and the theoretical chapter was organized chronologically. So what was the first theory about the topic that I focused on, and how did the theory develop on? Oh, Siri is asking me. Sorry. So you try to analyze patterns, turning points, and key debates that have shaped the direction of what is currently known. You make sure to provide your interpretation of how and why certain developments occurred. And if you choose this strategy, you must really avoid just summarizing sources and listing them, like X said this, then B said that, and then C did this, right? You don't want to do that. And no examiner cares if you review it like that, because it just doesn't read your voice, and your argument doesn't come through as the author. The second way to organize a literature review is using themes. So it's common to identify recurring themes in the literature. Your review can be organized into subsections according to different aspects of your topic. So let's say we're talking about inequalities to access to healthcare. We know that healthcare policy, language barriers, contextual challenges, economic access there's a lot of information on that. So rather than just having a hodgepodge of different studies talking about all these things intertwined, you break them into different sections that flows with a golden thread in between, by presenting them and reviewing them in this thematic order. The third common way that we do this for narrative review is to look at methodological emerging results in qualitative versus quantitative research. It's quite difficult if you're a novice researcher or someone, an emerging scholar, to synthesize both quantitative and qualitative research in the same paragraph or same section, because often you're not comparing similar outputs, right? So rather than trying to merge the two, I would advise you to break up your review into what has been quantitatively found. These are the results, the coefficients, the percentages, and then after that you provide context to the results by synthesizing the qualitative results, the findings of that. So you could discuss how a topic has been approached in empirical versus theoretical scholarship, or divide the literature into sociological, historical, cultural sources. That's also another way to look at it from a methodological standpoint. And then finally, you could organize it theoretically. So it's often the foundation for a theoretical framework, and you can use it to discuss various theories, models, definitions of key concepts. Alternatively, you can review how theory has evolved in response to new findings or results over time. So often new theories are built on previous theories to address shortcomings or supplement extant knowledge. And you might argue for the relevance of a specific theoretical approach to combine various theoretical components of or the framework for your research, right? So in psychology, we often have to write according to or interpret our results according to a specific theoretical lens. And if you review your theory properly in your literature review, you could justify having one or more theoretical approach to interpret your results. So what are the common mistakes we make when we review the literature? Firstly, and most importantly, not only when we review, but any study, is that our research problem is not clearly defined. Often we are chomping at the bit to get going, or we've been procrastinating for a very long time, and now we have to spark and write a chapter in 2 days of 40 pages. And we include sources that do not clearly relate to our research because we didn't define our research problem at the outset. Secondly, the second most common mistake is that we review exclusively relies on secondary analytical sources. So you review literature that other authors have reviewed rather than including relevant primary research studies or data. So you're taking the argument, voices, and interpretation of other authors rather than reading that source yourself and making your own interpretation. It's so common. I would read someone refer to something in a review or background of a study. I go look at the source that they have cited, and then that source is something completely different. So it's really important that you try to include as much as you can primary research studies or data that you have reviewed yourself, rather than just relying on what person X has said. The third most common mistake is that uncritically we accept another researcher's findings and interpretations as valid rather than offering your own interpretation of the reliability and validity of the results. So for a very long time, there's a very popular theory on how we make career decisions in our lives. And for a very long time, the critique against this theory in South Africa was based on one research paper that was done in the early 2000s. And basically, they said that this type of model is not applicable to certain cultural groups, specifically Xhosa speaking and Sotho speaking South Africans. But what they did is they assessed people with this model in English rather than their first language. So they made an error by saying this model isn't valid because they used the wrong language of instruction. So I reviewed that in my PhD and said, well, actually, the method to this conclusion is incorrect. So I just didn't accept that they said the research findings are X, Y, and Z. You have to offer your own interpretation of why these results could be presented in this specific way. The fourth most common mistake we make is that your search procedures are not established prior to conducting a review. So when you do a systematic review, you usually have to write a protocol for the search strategy. So you have to say, what are my search key terms? What are my Boolean terms? What is the formula and the databases that I'm going to search in? So it's really good to plan, as with most things in life, it's really good to plan your review before you start. So you have all of your keywords ready, your Boolean terms ready, and how you're going to enter that into the respective databases. And if you are affiliated to a university, make sure that you make contact with your faculty librarian, because they are experts at finding these keywords, these search terms. They do it on a daily basis for professors all the way down to first-year students. So it's really important to access that resource. You can, for example, at UCT, you can make an appointment with one of our librarians. They help you figure out the whole thing, and then you can start your search. The final common mistake is that you only include research that validates assumptions, your own assumptions, and doesn't consider contrary findings or alternative interpretations found in the literature. So let's say you are a psychologist working in practice and you've seen that a specific therapeutic approach really works for a specific mental health concern. A mistake would be that you only review literature that confirms this assumption rather than looking at all the evidence that speaks to whether this works in all populations in different settings and so on. So how do you write a literature review, right? So firstly, I think the most important thing that we all need to do is that we need to plan our literature review before we start. I've always struggled with a literature review because I know it's a large undertaking. I know there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I'm always worried, will I have enough information, enough time? So rather than planning out what I want to say, I just jump into Google Scholar, find a few papers, read them, and then start writing, right? And then I hit a block and I don't know what to write anymore. So if you define your research question from the start and you structure your literature review using the funnel method that I'll talk about now, it should go easier in formulating and writing a literature review that is coherent and that is comprehensive. So I have an example research question that we'll focus on now. So the research question is, what is the most effective treatment for depression in people living with HIV in South Africa? So I have my independent variable there. I have my participant population. I have my setting, right? So that should help me narrow down my search. And when I talk about the funnel method, so you can see the funnel on the right of your screen, usually what you do is you start with what the reader probably knows, like extant knowledge about the specific topic at hand. In this case, it's the topic here is depression, and we want to know what treatment for depression is most effective for people with HIV in South Africa. And as you review the literature, you want to narrow down the focus slowly but surely into what we would call the purpose of your study. So the red top band of the funnel is the most common information that most people working in your field should know, and some smart people in the general public too. The middle part would be more specific, narrowing down the focus to your specific topic. And then the green part would be, what is the actual purpose of your study? So if we take the topic of depression, you start with a broad focus to introduce the field. And that would be, you talk about depression. So for example, your opening sentence could be, depression is a global mental health concern and a leading cause of disability worldwide. Then you could include some information on the epidemiology. X percentage of people in the world are affected by depression. And then you can move over into how depression and HIV are interlinked and the risk factors shared by them, right? So you start really broad, you contextualize what the topic is about, what is currently known about the topic, and how this relates to your population. The next step of your funnel method of writing a literature review is to narrow the focus to your specific topic, right? Remember, we want to answer the question is, what is the most effective treatment? So now we've in the previous section, the broad focus, we've spoken about depression, its epidemiology, and how it links to HIV. Now we can start talking about what is the evidence for treatment of depression in the general population? What is the evidence for the treatment in the HIV population? And what are the common risk factors that contribute or that may compromise treatment? Right, so now you're narrowing the focus because now we went from depression in a broad sense to how is it treated and what is the evidence for that, right? And now you end up with a gap analysis, which is often the purpose of your study. And what we want to know is, out of all the treatment that is available, what is the most effective way to treat depression in the population of people with HIV in South Africa, right? So here you would say, although in the global north, there's evidence to show that CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy is the most effective way to treat depression in people with HIV. There's very little evidence to show that this is effective in South Africa. So that is the purpose of this study, right? To test this model in South Africa. So you have depression, epidemiology, HIV. You start with a broad focus. Then you start to narrow to talk about what evidence is there in the general population, the evidence in the HIV population, the risk factors, and obviously many other things depending on what your topic is. That should feed into efficacy, the gap of what your study is addressing. And if I read as an examiner, if I examine your PhD, your master's, if I read your literature review before I go to aims and objectives or your hypotheses, I should already have been able to formulate what I think the study is about. That is, if you do a literature review thoroughly, that is the ultimate end goal, is that the reader should be able to understand, I think this is what the study is about before they even read the purpose or the hypotheses. So that green endpoint of the funnel is what is the purpose of your study and can be presented as a research question or hypothesis. And it's best when you present this to be concise and clear, because it's signposting where the study is going. So usually you have your introduction, then you have your literature review that's written in this funnel method. You've got this one sentence, and then it just feeds into your aims and objectives, and thereafter your methodology. So it should be apparent, it should make sense that the literature that you've just reviewed makes sense to the reader why this is the study. There's no point in you talking about something completely unrelated to your topic and then all of a sudden introducing your aims and objectives. So there needs to be this golden thread that keeps talking about the topic at hand. In this case, about depression, HIV, and effective treatment, and then what the purpose is of your study. I have to acknowledge that writing an academic literature review is a skill that you acquire over years, and most of your supervisors would not expect that the first draft of your literature review should be perfect, right? It's an iterative process, and it's something that you develop over time. As a great literature review includes creativity, the way that you structure and put your different sources together, the way that you organize the literature review, and the golden thread that goes through that builds to this endpoint of the funnel is really crucial to decide whether you get a distinction or not if you're a graduate student, or whether you get less questions or comments on a review if you're submitting an article. So very briefly, that concludes how to conduct and write a literature review, and I'd now like to open up for some questions.
If you feel more comfortable to put your question into the chat box, you are welcome to do so. However, should you feel that you would like to ask the question verbally, you may do that as well. You are welcome to engage with the presenter. As you can hear, he is very well articulated and knowledgeable in the field. Caroline, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and thank you for the opportunity. Stefan, brilliant presentation. I have really had such a comprehensive, quick overview of the different types of reviews available. And thank you for unpacking your practical strategies for doing a narrative review. I do have one question about a scoping review. You mentioned earlier that the purpose of a scoping review would be to assess a field, get a feel for it, and determine whether or not a systematic review would be the next steps. But are there not other reasons you would do a scoping review as well, in that it has a place in the field and a right within its own right, not necessarily to move into another type of review?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So the most common reason people would undertake a scoping review is to see whether a systematic review is viable, but it's not the only reason, right? So a scoping review is still a very valuable resource in and of itself, and is often, you find maybe 10 or 20 additional papers to include in your systematic review, but it's still very, very thorough scoping review. So it's more comprehensive than a narrative review, but not as comprehensive as a systematic review, but still adds a lot of value. So if you consider doing a scoping review for a PhD or master's, please do that. It's not that you're just doing to see whether it's useful to do a systematic review.
Thank you.
Bridget, you may go next.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm in psych honors at the moment, and I'm busy writing a topic paper, a concept paper, and I'm finding myself almost cherry picking, finding the information that is going to support what I need to say. And I'm just battling, to do with the critiques. I don't know. How do we avoid, cherry picking, but still choosing information that is relevant to what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, so it's again, for narrative review that you're writing, it's impossible to include everything, and it's not the purpose, right? But what you need to do is, and often you will find a lot of resources or literature points towards the same type of conclusion. Like, let's say 80% of some papers would support your assumptions that you need to make. However, a thorough review would then include contrasting views and then where the gaps are. So where I would start is with the papers that have the most citations, right? So if you've got let's say you go through Google Scholar or EBSCO and you see that the top paper's got 8,000 citations, that is one that you probably need to include. However, there's some papers that do not have as many citations, but add something to the field or expands on the existing work, then you need to include that. You do not necessarily have to include every single paper that supports a specific point of view. And again, the purpose is not to include every single thing. It's just to provide a comprehensive review of what is being reviewed, of what your topic is.
Thank you so much.
Okay, then we have a question in the chat box. How do I combine results in meta-analysis?
Yeah, so the source of the results is the most important thing. And I'm not a meta-analysis expert. I've worked on a few, but the most important thing that you need is the odds ratio and mean scores so that you can combine them. But often it's not, and it depends on what your topic is, but often it's not possible to combine results because there's too much variance or the results are too heterogeneous. And in that case, you may need to do a qualitative synthesis of systematic reviews. So I can share a paper that we've recently published where we've combined a bunch of papers, but we couldn't combine the results of those papers because they did not have the necessary coefficients, and rather we just qualitatively analyzed and synthesized what was present in these results.
Okay, that would be appreciated if you could share that. I'm not sure if you are able to share it in the chat box.
Will do.
Okay, and then Ruva, you may go next.
All right, thank you. So my question is, can you just distinguish between like systematic reviews and meta-analysis?
Sure. So a systematic review often includes all studies that on a specific predefined topic, right? So you've got, let's say we're looking at the most effective treatment for people with depression and HIV in South Africa or low middle income countries. You'll include every single study that meets your inclusion criteria. However, what that study does not do is it tries to establish causation, but it does, in meta-analysis, shows you which of the treatment is the most effective by combining and aggregating their results. So a systematic review shows you what's the extant evidence, what is the causation between your independent and dependent variable, and then a meta-analysis would then combine the results of all of these systematic studies that you've reviewed and to give you a coefficient at the end to show you which is the most effective way to treat the intervention that you're interested in this topic, for example.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Fada asks, do you have any tips for ensuring your own argument or own voice comes through in the literature review?
So 2 things, and I'm going to hammer on about this. Plan your literature review before you start so that you know what you want to say, because if you structure it well, your argument is going to come through naturally. And then secondly, add your own interpretation in an academic way. Your own interpretation is not always, I think the study sucks, right? That's not an interpretation. That's just an opinion. If you base it on some methodological issue or some validity or reliability issue, then you can make a comment to say, although the authors found X, Y, and Z, the small sample size permits interpreting this with caution. That's just adding your own voice. And I think a reviewer really, I appreciate that as a reviewer when I see that the student has applied thought to what they're reviewing.
Charlotte, you can go next. Charlotte, your hand is up. Okay.
Thanks. Integrative. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, we can hear you now. You may go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to ask, what's the difference between an integrative review and a systematic review? Thanks.
I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. Integrated review is, I'm actually not sure. I've not heard of that methodology before.
Okay, thanks.
Nosipo asks, is it always necessary to include meta-analysis in combining your results for your systematic review?
So the question is, after you've done a systematic review, should you always do a meta-analysis too? No, it's not necessary, although a lot of people nowadays say it's advised because it's just so much more impactful. You've already done all of the work on conducting the systematic review, and now you just need to combine the results. But it's only appropriate if you are able to combine the results if they are homogeneous.
Ruba, your hand's up again. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My other question is, so if you're doing like a meta-analysis, right, do you have to record the validity and reliability of all the systematic reviews that you've used in that meta-analysis?
Yeah, so that usually comes part of when you do your risk of bias in your systematic review to show what is the reliability and validity of the results. And that should also give you an answer whether it is viable to do a meta-analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Oh, when do you know that you have enough sources to complete your review?
When you feel that you're done. There's no answer to that, right? So that's usually the question you ask, like, when can I be done with this hell, right? So when do you know that you have enough sources to complete your review? When your argument is completed, right? So that's, unfortunately, there's no, it's like, how long is a piece of string? There's no straight answer to that. If you do a systematic review, you have to include everything. If you have a poorly defined topic, you'll have many to include. For narrative review, it's more at your discretion. And if you're a student, I would probably involve my supervisor to help me make that decision. Is this sufficient? Because often the sections that you review, not necessarily the sources, the amount of sources. Obviously, you want a variety of sources that speak to a variety of topics, but rather what you're reviewing is not leaving any gaps pertinent to your topic. Because again, if you think about the funnel method, it should build into your purpose.
I get the feeling. I also just want to be done with my literature review. I feel it. So yes, I don't see any more questions. Please remember this is a safe space, so you can ask whatever questions that is relevant to the topic. We are here to try and assist you and help you with whatever it is that you need help with. The presentation was quite impactful and covered many different areas. So if you have any questions, please give us a shout, raise your hand, or pop the question into the chat box. So yes, Dr. Darby, I do agree with Linda. Congratulations, it was a really lovely presentation. It was a really lovely presentation. I was listening with both my ears open, and I've actually I enjoyed some of the topics or things that you were mentioning about how to look for things, and yeah, so even for someone like me who's been in academia for quite some time and reading so many things about literature review, this was a really lovely presentation. So thank you so much for that. Prof. Mapuda, are you around? Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you.
Yes, I am. I
Would you
was
like-
muted, sorry.
Okay, would you like to engage on anything?
I would just like to say thank you for the presentation. It was really insightful, and I think it touched on the most critical aspects, especially when one is embarking on literature review. So thank you so much to the presenter. We appreciated this.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And then for all the people who are asking questions about the presentation, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook page, Psychological Society of South Africa, Division of Research and Methodology. I'm going to copy the link to our YouTube page for you in the chat box. You can get the information there. I have a comment information session. Thank you. Gave us a lot to consider. Thank you for the comment. It's appreciated. Right. Kathleen says, thank you for the incredible session and great questions. There's a message. Ruva said, thank you. So yes, I'm trying to admit someone, but for some reason it's just going in a circle. It's not seemingly to allowing the person entry. Yeah. So, yeah, that is really lovely. Dr. Ravi, have you located that article regarding the qualitative synthesis of the meta analysis that you had done?
I have. I'm just going to stop sharing so I can just copy the link into the
chat box.
Yeah.
I must say it's only in the past maybe 5 years that this systematic reviews and meta-analysis and all these different forms of scoping reviews have been quite more prominent, especially in health sciences and humanities. So it's really useful to have somebody that's experienced in these things to differentiate for you what these things are, because it's like now you're sitting and you're like, now which one am I supposed to do? Which one is actually relevant to what I need to do? So that was really useful. Right, so it's 7 minutes to 1. Sorry, 7 minutes to 1. I can't see any more questions. The link to the paper has been received, Dr. Rabi. Okay. Are there any other questions? So I'm not sure if you've had lunch yet, since we've taken your lunch break during this presentation. And I'm wondering, maybe we should release you 5 minutes early so that you can maybe go grab something to eat. So if that's okay. If it's okay with everybody else, we're going to say thank you so much from the Division of Research and Methodology, Psychological Society of South Africa, for your amazing contribution and facilitating most especially students' development in an area that is quite anxiety provoking. So we want to say thank you for your assistance and contribution, and we really do appreciate working with you. I think last year and this year, we've really had a lovely engagement with you. So thank you from the DRM, and we release you to go and have lunch.
Cool. Thanks, Fatima. It was great presenting to you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.